bit of an update on the way we can actually use JSON in the Oracle environment, and really aimed at a developer trying to actually use some of these constructs.
Yeah, thanks. So let me I've got just a few slides I just want to pop through, and then we're going to do a little bit of a show and tell. But this is really, I suppose, just dipping our toes into JSON and NoSQL, and Oracle supports NoSQL through what we call SODA, which is a simple Oracle document access APIs. So yeah, just gonna have a little bit of talk about JSON, a little bit of talk about NoSQL and how Oracle supports NoSQL type workloads, and a little bit about why we're doing it. Just to kick it off, this is a slide from Maria Colgan, and I really like the presentation she does on Oracle. And if you get a chance, it's always worth seeing. There's a few on YouTube, and you see her around quite a bit. And it's one of my favorite, I suppose, talking points about Oracle database. Why I love Oracle databases, and that's really its ability to support, not just relational data, but there's a whole slew of capabilities that the database has to support, things like JSON, spatial, graph, machine learning, and to wrap that, with the robustness that comes with an Oracle database, with the security we have, with the backup and recovery, the ability to, flashback data, high availability through RAC, and then disaster recovery through DataGuard. So a whole bunch of great features that Oracle has. And it's just something to bear in mind when you're developing applications. And we're going to talk a little bit about Mongo and other, document databases like Dynamo. And that's, you can understand why those databases are really interesting to developers, because they're very easy to set up. But really, once you get an application and you get it into production, then you find that you've got other challenges to think about, or at least the production support team do, which is really around, look, how do we maintain and manage this data, and how do we use this data that we're putting in there? So anyway, that's a little kickoff. So when I spoke, I think a month or so ago, we were doing some debugging using Chrome debugger, and we're doing some JSON as our little demo that we were debugging on. So I'm just going to touch on this again. And JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's something that was developed out of using JavaScript. It's the way JavaScript represents objects. So if you have a JavaScript application running, it's working on its object, but it needs to maybe do something with it. So it converts it into JSON, which is a format of data, and then the JavaScript application can save that or send it off to something. And it's also something that's become really ubiquitous in the development world, where JSON is kind of the standard now for data interchange. So it's important, that we understand it, and it's important that we can support it. One of the great things about JSON is programmatically for a developer, it's just the way it happens, right? That's just, JavaScript supports JSON. It's very simple to take an object and serialize it and turn it into JSON, and vice versa. And you see on this page here, I've got just an example of a JavaScript object that's a person. I've got an employee ID, I've got a first name, last name, email, and a department that I work in. That's typical of what you'd see, in a JavaScript object, and we use JSON to send and receive that data. So you've got your application. It might be JavaScript, or it might be Python, or it could be something that's using JSON, and this program wants to store that data somewhere. So it's got a choice to write it to a file or write it to a database. The developer has to make that choice. If we're looking at a database makes a lot of sense. And really, up until now, we've spoken a lot about relational databases using traditional data types, and you'd be familiar with that. You've got columns, you've got rows, and those rows have data types. And this is typically, that object that I showed before, it's typically how it'd be stored in a relational database. We would create columns, and then we'd have to write, SQL statements to to do the data manipulation on that table, we'd have to insert, update, delete, select. And this stuff gets, it's kind of like a level of expertise all in itself. You have people who have got expertise in databases and people who have got expertise in developing applications. DBAs and developers are like cats and dogs. They're always at each other. So developers wanted an easy way to be able to store data, and they don't want to have the dramas of having to go to a DBA all the time and say, can you add a column to my table, or I want to change this data type. It becomes a bit of a hassle. So that's where JSON started becoming a little bit more popular. JSON allows us a lot more flexibility in the way a developer may want to store their data. And here you can see I'm still using a relational database with a table, but now I've created a column which has got my JSON data in it. And it allows me a lot of flexibility with the data that I want to store in there. And you can see I've just gone and modified, my program. I wanted to store some additional information about that employee, with their favorite food. And so just in the program, all I did was just add, another attribute to that object called favorite food. And then when I went and stored in the database, it just happens. So it's taken a bit of the complexity out of it. But as a developer, I still need to know SQL, and it's still a bit of work to get that data out and put it back in. I'm using, SQL statements. And here's just a little bit of an example, of why document databases to developers are so, I suppose, so attractive. It solves almost all the database problems for a developer. So a developer doesn't necessarily need to know much about SQL now. And you can see there's an example here where, we've got a bit of SQL that's going to insert, a billing record into a database, and you have to write that SQL. You have to have the columns that you're going to insert the data into. You have to get those data items and bind them in, and then you have to execute the statement. And then down the bottom is an example of a NoSQL command to store a record in a document database. And you just say, insert this object. That's how simple it is. So if you want to insert the object, you say insert it. If you want to find an object, you just say find an object, and you use just a query string. Very, very simple for a programmer to actually use databases. And that's why, document databases or NoSQL APIs have become very, very popular in recent times. Okay. So
it's effectively giving you a sort of unstructured access to a database.
Yes. It's very, very simple for a programmer to use a NoSQL database. Cool. And that's why they love them. And it's kind of an abstraction away from the database. They don't have to worry about that anymore. Any of that SQL, that pesky SQL underneath it.
But you're getting all the benefits of being stored in the database.
Yes, yeah, 100%. So Oracle provides a NoSQL API for databases as well. So some of the popular NoSQL databases are Mongo or Dynamo or Cassandra. There's a lot out there. Developers have their reasons for using different ones. A lot of them is just because that's what they know. They want to, just start developing, and they go, oh, Mongo is a NoSQL database, and that's what I'm going to use. Probably one of the limitations with NoSQL databases, and I don't want to trash them too much, is that they're almost like a one-trick pony. So you can use your NoSQL API to put data in there or to get data back. But what happens, when you put your application into production and then you need to do something with that data, apart from putting it in there or getting it back? Say, you're storing sales records in a database using NoSQL API, and then all of a sudden you need to do some analytics on that SQL. So how are you going to do that? And if you've got a NoSQL database, you may have to bolt on additional capabilities to be able to do that. One of the reasons I really like Oracle is that NoSQL is provided as part of the database, and you still got access to all the other Oracle capabilities. So with Oracle database, you can use the NoSQL API to put data in, take data out, but you can also use SQL on that on that underlying data. So you can use traditional SQL to access that data or perform analytics. You can hook up your BI tools to it. You can use spatial capabilities against that JSON data even. So Oracle supports JSON spatial data. You can add spatial indexes. You can actually take that the NoSQL data and you can turn it into a view or a table and do operations on it. So there's a lot of great reasons for using Oracle for NoSQL.
So Chris, could I just add, sorry, the work we did with the Formula One simulator where we were streaming data. So the original code for that data is Python, and it just creates a JSON document. So what we did was we took original code that wasn't, particularly friendly, but we took original code, and all we did was add essentially a library just to send it to the Oracle database. And then, so that all comes in as raw JSON. So we're up to, I think, 500,000 rows in our Formula One simulator right now. But what's quite nice is that we don't really care what the document structure looks like, but on the read side, on the consume side, we use a lot of the Oracle analytical functions to do things like the leaderboards. So all of that stuff you see that I've showed in the past in Apex, where it's all nicely ordered and all those sorts of things, where we do fastest lap times. And we've actually seen some quite nice analytics capability now from some of our colleagues where they've done things like GeoJSON. So it's kind of spatial analytics on the data that we've done. So they're using Oracle functions from the database on that, essentially that raw JSON data. So it just goes to show the power of being able to use, this kind of data, these documents, if you like, but using the capabilities that Oracle provides. It's actually been a real eye-opener for me, and anyone that uses, Mongo, for instance, because of the API, and I'm sure you're going to cover some of that, but essentially it means that we don't have to change anything in the back end, and we can still use the cool Oracle functions that are around.
Yeah, 100%. We're going to cover a little bit of that off when we do our a little bit of a demo. But yeah, you're right. You've got access to that document database and that API for inserting or retrieving data, so you can have developers write in that, and then you can just have the underlying database, the Oracle database, that adds all that extra capability. And plus, don't forget things like RAC, Data Guard. If you ever get to the stage where you need charting, that's supported as well with Oracle. Containerization and pluggable databases, that's a big one for people who are developing modern web apps to be able to use that sort of technology. So it's all there, everything you need. And we also support, you can directly connect to the database using like a SQLnet connection, or you can access it via a REST service as well. And important to point out, for those that are playing around with Oracle on-prem, so if you haven't got an autonomous database, you can still use JSON, Soda. Autonomous adds some really nice things on top of it when we're looking at the Mongo API. But yeah, if you've got an Oracle database and you're running an on-prem workload, Soda as well. What else we got here? I think, so time for show and tell. So we're going to have a look at a few different scripts. We're going to have a look at a couple of Python scripts. Going to be using a Python script that's going to talk to a Mongo database, Python script that's been modified, the same Python script that's been modified to talk to Oracle using Soda. Going to load some data using NoSQL, and then we're going to view the data using conventional SQL. And then I've got a little Node.js script that can connect to a Mongo or an autonomous database using that Mongo API. So a little bit of fun. Let's have a look. I'll just stop this preso now. I've got a little terminal. So I have, maybe I'll just better share my desktop. You can see my desktop there, okay?
Quite small.
Yep, all good.
Is it all good? Is it a bit small?
It is a bit small for us old fellas, and while Franco's not here. I'll do the complaining on it.
How do I change? I'm not too sure if I can change my font size on this. How do I do that? I've never done that.
Is it terminal? Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it Mac? Command plus.
Yeah. Yep. What is it? What do you reckon it is?
Command plus.
Oh, it's just that simple. Oh,
Yeah.
there we go.
There you go. See, you just learned
Okay.
something.
All right, there we go. So what I have done is I've got an autonomous database here. I've got just my own little always free tier, and I've got a couple of databases in here. One of them is my autonomous JSON database, and in that, if you go into that and have a bit of a poke around, you can see some of the things that you can do. So I've created a database. I've created a user in there that's got the Soda app role. And then from here, I can access a lot of things. So these are the things from the autonomous database. I've got access to Application Express. I've got access to database actions where I can do things in the database. It's given me some endpoints for RESTful data services that I can use. And it's also given me an API for MongoDB. So if I want to do some straight MongoDB stuff into the database, I can. And Oracle Machine Learning RESTful services. So it's all there. It's all configured when I created my database. I can also, it's also got some links to download Soda drivers, and we'll have a look at that. Download the instant client. And what I've done is I've also created a little virtual machine in my same tenancy, a little Linux machine, and I want to connect to the database directly. So I downloaded my client wallet, which allows me to create a secure connection into the database. So we're going to be doing some connections directly into the database. We're also going to be doing some connections via RESTful services. That defined. Oops. So I downloaded my wallet and I put it onto my little Linux machine here. And if I change directory into there, I've got a tnsnames.aura. So downloading that wallet is giving me a tnsnames.aura. And it's giving me a SQLnet.aura. And the only thing I needed to do.
We do want to explain what that means, Chris.
Okay, so this is yeah. So this is all the SQLnet, or the ability to connect remotely over the wire to an Oracle database. So you define in here, like the DBAs would recognize this, where you have these connect strings that you connect the database with. And what they've done with Autonomous is the Oracle guys who created this stuff have set all this stuff up so it automatically downloads. And the only thing I had to do to make this thing work, and they tell you to do this when you download it, is I just got to change this directory. And I just got to, when I download this, it just says put this, actually point it to the right directory. Once I've done that, I can make a connection to my database. I've created an alias in there just to make it easy called JSON. And I put in my hopefully that's going to work. And I've created it connected to the database. So I've got a SQLnet connection from my Linux virtual machine into my autonomous database. All good.
So just to just clear that one up, Chris, and thank you. When we use Apex, obviously all of this connection stuff is done under the covers, so we don't worry about it. There's many different ways to access the database from various different systems. The TNS names is like an IP address of the database and a sort of connection profile. So it just sets those things. So when you get the wallet, it gives you like a secure connection string, and that's, so the command line version that Chris is using here is just another way to access the database. We could quite easily use the database actions. We could quite easily use the SQL workshop. We can use SQL developer. So all of these use the kind of it's the same, They just, this one's a bit more exposed in terms of what it looks like. So I wouldn't be too not confused, but it
Don't
makes it
panic.
look a bit more complicated. Yeah, don't panic.
Yeah, don't panic.
It's just
Don't
a
panic.
way of accessing the database, that's all.
Yeah. So this is just one way. And the reason I did this was because I'm going to be connecting to the database using like a direct connection in. So I've got a Python script that we're going to just have a play with. It needed to create a SQLnet connection. And you know, I suppose the people who played around traditionally with Oracle databases would maybe have some familiarity with TNS named and SQLnet. If not, you can always reach out, and happy to help out, you know, if you've got some questions around how to do that. What I also have on my little VM is a MongoDB, and I access that using Mongo SH. If it's going to work. There we go. I've connected. I've connected to my Mongo database, and I can show my databases in Mongo. There they are. And I can say use admin database. And now this is kind of like the no. I've got a collection there called movies. All right. And we're going to be using this a little bit later. But anyway, that's for the Mongo people. That's how obviously you connect to the database. I'm going to show a bit later how you can use the same thing to talk to an autonomous database, which will be interesting. But let me go into my directory where I've got some examples of some code. So I've got one Python script here called Mongo test, and I've got another one here called Oracle test. And if I was to view that Mongo test, I can see this is just a simple little Python script. I import a few things. One of the things I import is the PY Mongo module. I have some JSON data. So this is an array of JSON data. There's 4 elements in the array, and these are just people. So there's a name, property, a status, a level, and a score. I don't know. I just downloaded this from Python or Mongo tutorial somewhere, and so this is what I found. And I just created this, and I'm going to connect to Mongo database that's running on my local machine. I'm going to create a collection called profiles. I'm going to do a insert many. So this is like a bulk insert into a database. I'm going to insert all these records from seed data. So there's 4 records, and you can see how simple that is. Insert many. And then I'm going to do a query. And my query is looking for anyone with the name of Jesse. And then I'm going to print the results. So let's see if this is going to work. It may not actually. Because it didn't like it because I'd actually already done that. Let me just. I forgot to do a little cleanup. Yeah, this script is just like a little one-shot wonder. Because it's hitting a conflict if I run it second time. There you go, running it. So it's inserted the data, and then it's queried the data, and it's returned the JSON. So this is a typical NoSQL type script. So what I did was I wanted to do the same thing in Python, talking to an Oracle database. So I've got one here called Oracle test.python. And you can see it's very simple, very similar. So instead of importing PyMongo, I now import CX Oracle, which is our Oracle NoSQL API. And then I have the same seed data, and I connect to my Oracle database instead of connecting to the Mongo, and I do a insert many on that seed data. So it's almost identical to the script, and instead this is going to be talking to an Oracle database. And there it goes. So with very little changes to my my code, I was able to connect to a Mongo database or also connect to an Oracle database and use the NoSQL API. Something that might be a little bit more interesting is using the Mongo interface into autonomous database. So I've got a script here, a Node.js script called mongomovies.javascript. And if I have a look at that script, so this is a Node.js that's going to connect to a Mongo database. And I've got in here a URI that's going to connect to that database. So this is like a network connection to Mongo. And I'm going to connect to that Mongo database, and I'm going to insert a JSON document into the database using just the insert one, and hopefully
you can't use the word hopefully, it's not allowed.
All right, there we go. So my Node.js application run, and it connected to a Mongo database, and it inserted one record of a movie called Back to the Future. Let me just edit that now. So this is another Mongo demo Node.js. So let me change this Mongo URI here. And what I've also got in this same script is a connect for Oracle.
And that's the URL that was shown on that database screen that we saw before.
That's right. That's right. So I've got a username, password, and I've got a connect string. So all I've done is this code is exactly the same now. And I've just changed it. I would say, don't connect to the Mongo database. Now you're going to connect to the Oracle database. We're going to try and connect. We're going to connect as a user called admin or a database called admin. We're going to create a collection called movies. We have created an object. So this is a JavaScript object called doc. And then we're going to insert that document into the database. And then we're going to run a query using this query string. And we're going to find one record, and we're going to hopefully print it out. So let's try that. And there you go. So I've switched over from using a Mongo database to an Oracle Autonomous database just by changing the connect string. Now let's go and have a look at, so has anyone got any questions that they want to pop up about doing that? Or was that kind of straightforward? No questions?
We'll ping a few around a bit afterwards, but
yeah,
keep going. I mean, the good news here is that all you had to change in your app was the URL, and I think that's a key message, that if you've got people who are using Mongo and they want to, even if they want to set up a quick sort of test or run an app in the free tier, for instance, that we don't actually have to change the app. You just change the connection string, and usually you wouldn't have that exposed in the code like that. You'd host it as a configuration somewhere. So, if you're having DR or test or non-prod type environments, this is a great way to get up and running without spinning up more Mongo databases.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things around the way Oracle implements their NoSQL is that when you say create a collection, so you say create a collection called movies, and I've got one here. I've got another script that actually connected to the database, create a collection, and loaded a whole heap of movie data in. What Oracle does is that that API abstracts the database away from you, but underneath the covers, it's going to create a table, and it has put in things that are needed to support that document database style of collection. And we have an ID, which is like our primary key, but then we also store it as a JSON document, as a binary large object. So the database does all this underneath the covers. But what you can do, then you can actually use that, not just as a NoSQL database, but you can also use it as a regular database, and I can run a query like this against it. So
one thing, Chris, there, just so that people, and again, those who are DBAs know all this stuff already, so I'm not going to get anywhere near as complex. But one of the reasons we use a blob or a binary large object, as you called it, is that it's compressed. So it's got quite a nice compression. So your JSON documents can be quite large. The ones we use in the F1 are really small, so they're a bit insignificant. But blob is a nice way to compress them in the database. So another good reason to do it that way. Yeah.
So what this query is, so now I'm looking at just using regular SQL against this document table. So we've inserted it using NoSQL APIs and treating it like a document database. But underneath the covers, Oracle has put that in a table, and I can actually run SQL against it. And what I'm doing here is I'm extracting a few fields out of that JSON document column, the one that was a blob. And the first thing I'm doing here is I'm saying serialize that. So basically take that out and turn it into something I can read. But I'm also saying, give me some information out of that JSON document, like the title. And that's it. Actually, that's the only thing I'm taking out of it. So I'm asking for the title of the movie that's stored as in JSON, and also the entire JSON document. So if I run this, let's see what it does. So it's returned the ID, which is like the primary key. I pull that title out, and here's the full JSON document that I'd actually inserted in using NoSQL API. Great. What I can also do, because this is Oracle, I can say I want to create a view on top of that JSON document, and so I don't have to worry about all of this. And so I've also created a view. I'm just using movies view. So I created this view before this demo, and now I can just treat this as a regular table and query from it. And we couldn't have a session without talking Application Express. So Application Express is actually running a query on that view, and here I can see that data as well. If I wanted to, I could actually put a form on this and update that JSON document. So there's no end to the fun you can have with JSON and Soda, no